Chioma, I have loved you ever since. Please, will you marry me?
I will never marry a poor man. A beautiful lady like me deserves a rich man, not a poor man like you.
Listen, come closer, let me tell you a story. A story about a girl who rejected a poor man because she thought he was nothing. But years later, when life broke her into pieces, she came back to the same man she once laughed at, this time, on her knees, asking for love. Chioma was the kind of girl that made the whole village stop and stare. Her skin was smooth and dark like the richer soil after rain, her eyes were bright and full of fire, and when she walked, she carried herself like someone who believed she was born for a bigger world. She was beautiful, everyone knew it, and Chioma knew it too. From the time she was a little girl, she would sit outside her mother's small mud house and look far beyond the village hills, dreaming of tall buildings, fine clothes, and a life that smelled nothing like the smoke from their cooking fire. She did not hate her village. She simply believed she deserved more than it could ever give her. Her mother, Mama Chioma, was a hardworking woman who sold firewood and groundnuts at the market every single day. Her father had died when Chioma was only 7, leaving behind a leaking roof, a small farm, and 3 children to feed. Mama Chioma never complained. She tied her wrapper tight, carried her load, and kept moving. But Chioma washed her mother's hands, rough, cracked, and tired, and made a silent promise to herself. "I will never live like this," she whispered one night, staring at the ceiling where a small lizard ran across the clay. "I will marry a rich man. A man with a car. A man with shoes that shine." She said it like a prayer, over and over, until it became the only dream she knew. The village boys loved Chioma. They brought her mangoes, offered to carry her water pot, and tripped over their own feet just to make her laugh. But Chioma was never impressed. She looked at them and saw poverty, patched trousers, dusty feet, and futures as small as the village itself. She waved them away like flies. There was one boy, however, who never gave up, not because he was foolish, but because his heart was too honest to pretend he did not care. His name was Emeka. He was tall, quiet, and serious in the way that only truly good people are. He had grown up 2 houses away from Chioma, and he had loved her since the day she shared her last piece of yam with a crying child at the market, a small act of kindness she had long forgotten, but that Emeka had never stopped remembering. Emeka was not rich. His family was poor, just like everyone else in the village. But Emeka had something that no money could buy, a burning hunger to be something. He woke before sunrise to help his father on the farm, studied at night with a small kerosene lamp when everyone else slept, and never wasted a single day feeling sorry for himself. He carried his dreams quietly, the way strong people do, not making noise about them, just walking toward them one sunrise at a time. And through all of it, one thought stayed warm in his chest like a small fire that never died. One day, when the time was right, he would tell Chioma how he felt. He would ask her to be his, and together, they would build something beautiful. Before this story begins, if you love real-life stories that teach deep lessons, hit that subscribe button now, because this story will change the way you see love and choices forever. Nobody asked Emeka to become the man of Chioma's house. There was no agreement, no arrangement, no meeting under a tree where someone said, "Please look after them." It simply happened, the way all truly good things happen, quietly, naturally, without announcement. It started the rainy season after Chioma's father died, when the roof of their mud house began to leak so badly that Mama Chioma was placing clay pots on the floor every night to catch the water. Emeka's mother mentioned it in passing at the market. By the following morning, 17-year-old Emeka had already gathered palm fronds, borrowed patching materials from his uncle, and climbed onto that roof before Mama Chioma had even finished her morning prayers. "Emeka, come down from there." Mama Chioma called out, shielding her eyes from the early sun and looking up at him with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "You will fall and break your neck." Emeka looked down at her and grinned, that quiet, steady grin of his. "Mama, I will not fall. And even if I do, the roof will still be fixed." The neighbors who were watching laughed. Old Baba turned, who sat outside his doorway every morning like a statue, nodded slowly and said to no one in particular, "That boy. That boy has the heart of a father." Chioma had stood at the doorway watching, a wrapper tied around her chest, her expression carefully neutral. But she watched. And somewhere in a small corner she did not like to look at, something in her noticed. That was only the beginning. As the months and years rolled on, Emeka became a quiet but unmistakable presence in the story of Chioma's family. When Mama Chioma's groundnut business ran low one dry season and she could not restock, it was Emeka who appeared one morning with a full bag of raw groundnuts, set it down inside the doorway, and left before she could even find the words to thank him. When Chioma's younger brother, Chidi, needed school sandals but there was no money, Emeka took on extra farm work for 2 weeks and handed the money to Mama Chioma without making a speech about it. "For Chidi's sandals," he said simply, and turned to leave. Mama Chioma held the money in her palm and looked at his retreating back with the expression of a woman watching something rare and irreplaceable. "God will reward you, my son," she called after him. Emeka just raised one hand in acknowledgement and kept walking. The village noticed all of it. It was impossible not to. In a small village where everyone's business is everyone's business, Emeka's devotion to Chioma's family was the kind of story people discussed in low voices with raised eyebrows and warm smiles. The women at the borehole talked about it. The men on the farm talked about it. Even the children who ran errands between compounds knew that if something broke in Mama Chioma's house, Emeka would fix it. If something was needed, Emeka would find a way. He carried their firewood without being asked, chased away the young men who sometimes came to the compound at night making noise, and sat with Chioma's little sister Ada and helped her with reading exercises on evenings when no one else had the patience. He had, without any formal ceremony, become the invisible pillar of a house that had been leaning since the day its father died. There was a woman in the village named Mama Ngozi, a round, loud, deeply opinionated woman who sold pepper soup from a big pot outside her compound every evening, and who considered herself the official keeper of village wisdom on matters of love and marriage. She had been watching Emeka and Chioma for years the way a farmer watches the sky before planting, with patient certainty that she already knew what was coming. One evening, as a group of women sat around her pepper soup pot eating and talking, Mama Ngozi put down her ladle, wiped her hands on her wrapper, and delivered her verdict like a judge at the end of a long trial. "That Emeka will marry Chioma," she said, with the calm finality of someone stating that the sun rises in the east. "Mark my words. Write it on the wall. I have watched that boy since he was carrying firewood on his head, and I am telling you, everything he does for that girl. A man does not fix a woman's mother's roof, pay her brother's school fees, and chase bad boys away from her compound unless that woman is already his wife in his heart." The other women nodded, some smiling, some making the appreciative sound of people hearing a truth they had already privately arrived at. Mama Ngozi picked up her ladle again. "The only question is whether Chioma has eyes to see what is standing right in front of her." Even the children of the village had absorbed this understanding the way children absorb all true things, without being told directly, but through years of watching. Chioma's younger sister Ada, who was 12 at the time, once asked Emeka directly, with the brutal honesty that only children dare use, "Emeka, are you going to marry my sister?" Emeka had paused in the middle of repairing the leg of their wooden bench. He looked at Ada for a moment, then smiled, a slow, private smile that said more than any words would. "Keep reading your books, Ada," he said, and went back to work. Ada nodded seriously, as if this confirmed everything, and ran inside to tell her mother. Mama Chioma, stirring her pot, had smiled into the steam and said nothing. Chioma herself was not blind to Emeka's care, she simply chose to file it in the wrong place in her heart. She appreciated him the way you appreciate a familiar tree that has always provided shade, without ever really looking at it, without ever imagining it gone, without understanding what the yard would feel like without it. She was kind to him in her own way. She thanked him when he helped. She called his name first when something needed fixing. She saved him a portion of food sometimes, wrapped in a leaf, sent through Ada without being asked to. But she never looked at him the way he looked at her. And everyone in the village could see the difference, that small, painful gap between the man who loved completely and the woman who received that love like a small ordinary thing. Old Bobaton, who had watched more love stories in his long life than he could count, sat outside his doorway one evening as Emeka walked past carrying a repaired water drum back to Chioma's compound. The old man called out to him. "Emeka, come here." Emeka set down the drum and approached respectfully. Bobaton looked at him for a long, searching moment. "That girl," he said quietly, nodding toward Chioma's compound. "You love her?" It was not a question. Emeka said nothing, which was its own answer. Bobaton nodded slowly. "Just make sure," the old man said carefully, "that when the time comes, you speak before life speaks for you." Emeka bowed his head slightly, picked up the drum, and carried it the rest of the way in silence. But those words stayed with him for a long time afterward, turning slowly in his chest like a key looking for its lock. It was a warm evening when Emeka finally decided the time had come. The sun was going down behind the hills, painting the sky in deep orange and gold, and the village was settling into its quiet nighttime rhythm, children being called inside, women stirring pots, old men talking under trees about things only old men discuss. Emeka had washed his face, pressed his best shirt, the blue one with 2 small buttons missing, and walked slowly toward Chioma's compound. His heart was beating so loudly he was certain the goats nearby could hear it. He had been carrying these words for years. He had swallowed them down so many times that they had grown heavy and ripe inside him, and now they were ready to come out whether he was fully ready or not. Chioma was sitting under the big mango tree at the edge of her compound, plaiting her younger sister Eda's hair. When she saw Emeka approaching, she gave him that look, half amused, half impatient, like he was a small problem she had not yet decided how to solve. "Emeka," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "What do you want this evening?" Several neighbors were nearby, Mama Ngozi washing dishes just outside her fence, old Bobaton on his stool, 2 young girls fetching water from the drum, children running between compounds. Emeka knew people were watching. He had not planned for an audience. But something in him, something tired of waiting, tired of carrying, tired of hoping in silence, refused to turn back. He stood before her and spoke clearly, his voice low but steady, every word carried on years of feeling. "Chioma," he said, "I have known you all my life. I have been in your compound when your roof was leaking. I have worked extra hours so your brother could have sandals for school. I have chased away every boy who came to this gate with the wrong intentions. I have done all of it, not because I was asked, not because I wanted praise, but because I love you. I have loved you for longer than I can explain." He paused. The whole area seemed to go still, even the evening breeze. "I am not a rich man today. I will not lie to you about that. But I am a hardworking man with a plan and a future I am building with my own 2 hands. I want to build it with you beside me. Give me a chance, Chioma. Please." For one long moment, something moved across Chioma's face, something soft and uncertain, like a shadow of a different answer passing quickly behind her eyes. Mama Ngozi at the fence had stopped washing entirely and was holding a wet cloth frozen in midair. Ada had turned around to stare at her sister with wide, breathless eyes, her braids half done and forgotten. Even old Bobaton had leaned slightly forward on his stool. The whole village, it seemed, was holding its breath, because the whole village had waited for this moment, and the whole village, in its collective heart, already knew what it was hoping to hear. But Chioma stood up slowly, and what came next was not what anyone had hoped for. Chioma looked at Emeka for a moment that stretched long and uncomfortable. Then she shook her head, and what came out of her mouth arrived like a cold wind that no one had seen coming, even those who knew her best. "Emeka," she said, loudly, clearly, without lowering her voice for the neighbors who were very obviously listening. You fixed my roof. You bought my brother sandals. I am grateful for all of that. But gratitude is not love, and love cannot feed me. You are a good person, but you are a poor person. And I did not survive my father's death and my mother's suffering just to marry another man with nothing. She paused, and her chin lifted slightly, that old familiar gesture of a woman who had decided something and dared anyone to question it. I want a man with a car. A man with a real house. Not a man who patches my roof and calls it a future. The silence that followed was the kind that feels loud. Mama Ngozi set down her wet cloth very slowly. Ada's mouth had fallen open. One of the water girls had forgotten to keep walking. Even old Boba Tond, who had lived through wars and funerals and every kind of human drama, closed his eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in the particular grief of a man who had quietly prayed for a different ending. Emeka stood very still. His jaw was tight. His hands were loose at his sides. He did not flinch, did not shout, did not crumble publicly the way a lesser man might. But if you were standing close enough, if you were watching carefully, you could see it happen. Something behind his eyes, something that had burned steady and patient for years, went very quietly dark. Like a lantern whose oil had finally run out. He nodded once. Just once. Then he said, in a voice so quiet it was almost only for himself, "All right, Chioma." He picked up the small dignity a man gathers when he has nothing else left to carry, turned around, and walked away. He did not look back. He walked past Mama Ngozi, who looked at the ground. He walked past old Boba Tond, who watched him with tired, knowing eyes. He walked past the water girls who quickly pretended to be busy. He walked all the way home, went inside, sat down in the dark, and for the first time in his adult life, allowed himself to feel the full weight of a love that had been refused. His mother found him there an hour later and put her hand on his shoulder without asking any questions. Sometimes a mother's hand in the dark is the only medicine there is. The next morning, the village woke up and spoke of nothing else. Mama Ngozi's pepper soup stand became an unofficial court where the matter was heard, argued, and judged. The women were divided, some who understood Chioma's desire for a better life, and many more who shook their heads at the manner of her refusal, the cold public shaming of a man who had done nothing but love her well. She could have said no gently, one woman said, stirring her tea hard. He fixed her roof. He bought her brother sandals. She could have at least looked him in the eye when she broke his heart. Old Boba Tond, when asked his opinion, said only 4 words, quietly, with his eyes on the distance, "She will remember this." And then he said nothing more. At this point, what would you do? Would you choose love or money? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 3 weeks after Emeka's rejection, the village received a visitor. He arrived in a large black car that gleamed so brightly in the afternoon sun that 3 children ran out to look at their reflections in the door. His name was Mr. Kelvin, and he was everything that Chioma had ever described when she spoke of the man she wanted: shoes that shone, a shirt without a single wrinkle, a watch on his wrist that caught the light and scattered it like small stars. He had come to the village on business, staying with a distant relative for a few days, and he walked through the market on his first afternoon with the easy, commanding presence of a man who has never once doubted his own welcome. Chioma saw him at the market on his second day. She was buying tomatoes when he stopped nearby and smiled at her, that wide, practiced smile of a man who knew exactly what effect it had. "Excuse me," he said pleasantly, "can you help me find the palm oil seller? I have been walking in circles." Chioma looked at him. Then at the car parked at the market entrance. Then at the watch. Then back at his face. She smiled, a real smile, wide and bright, the first genuine smile she had worn since the mango tree evening, and said, "Of course. Follow me." She took him to the palm oil seller by the longest possible route, and by the time they arrived, he had her name, she had his phone number, and the course of her life had already begun to bend. He came back to the village 4 more times in the following weeks, and each time, he came for Chioma. He brought gifts that the village had never seen: perfume in a glass bottle, a bracelet with a small golden clasp, imported biscuits in a decorated tin. The girls in the village watched with unashamed envy. The mothers watched with cautious admiration. Chioma received each gift with a radiant happiness that was painful to observe, painful because of what it confirmed, painful because of who was no longer there to see it. Emeka had, by this point, quietly begun making preparations to leave. He had heard about Mr. Kelvin. He had heard about the gifts. He said nothing. He just worked faster, packed quieter, and burned with a focused energy that his mother recognized as the particular fire of a man converting heartbreak into fuel. Mama Chioma was not dazzled. She watched Mr. Kelvin from a careful distance, his quick charm, his practiced compliments, the way his eyes calculated even while his mouth smiled, and she felt the slow unease of a woman whose instincts were speaking louder than the pretty surface in front of her. One evening she sat Chioma down. "My daughter," she said quietly, "this man, how much do you truly know about him? Not what he shows you. What you actually know." Chioma laughed softly and touched her mother's hand. "Mama, I know that he is kind and he is successful and he wants me. What else should I need to know?" Mama Chioma looked at her daughter for a long moment, at her bright eyes and her beautiful certainty, and felt the specific sadness of a parent watching a child walk confidently towards something she cannot yet see is a cliff. The wedding came fast, the way things always move fast when one person is very determined and the other is very dazzled. Within 4 months of their meeting, Mr. Kelvin had spoken to Mama Chioma, paid the bride price, and announced the wedding date. The village, whatever its private opinions, threw itself into the celebration with full energy, because this is what villages do. They show up. They cook. They dance. They celebrate one of their own, even when their hearts hold quiet reservations. The day itself was extraordinary. A white canopy tent filled the village square. There were caterers, a generator, bright strings of lights in the trees, and a band that played until midnight. Chioma wore a dress so white and so full it swept the ground behind her like a slow, quiet wave. Her hair was done by a stylist from the city. Her shoes had heels so high that Ada and a young cousin held her arms on both sides as she walked, whispering encouragements like coaches at a sporting event. People came from 3 neighboring villages. The food never ran out. The music never stopped. It was, by every visible measure, the most magnificent thing the village had ever hosted. But there were 2 quiet things on that day that nobody made speeches about. The first was Mama Chioma, who smiled at every person who greeted her and danced when the music played, but who was seen, by those watching closely, wiping her eyes alone near the water drum at the back of the compound, not with the tears of a joyful mother, but with something more complicated and more private. The second was old Boba Tond, who sat at the edge of the celebration, ate his food slowly, and when someone leaned over and asked him cheerfully, "Boba, what do you think? Is this not a wonderful day?" He chewed quietly for a moment and then said, very softly, "Ask me again in 5 years." Then he asked for more pepper soup and said nothing else all evening. Emeka was not there. He had left the village 11 days before the wedding, before the tent was even erected, before the caterers were called. He left early one morning while the village was still sleeping, carrying a bag on his shoulder and the kind of silence that settles over a person when they have made a decision so firm it requires no announcement. Only his mother and his closest friend Ton knew. His mother had held his face in both her hands at the door, looked at him for a long time, and then kissed his forehead. "Come back bigger than your pain," she told him. He nodded. Then he walked down the red path, away from the village, away from the wedding tent being assembled in the square, away from the girl who had not chosen him, and toward the only thing left that still made complete sense, the future he was going to build for himself. The apartment was stunning. White walls, smooth floors, tall windows that made the city look like a painting. There were 2 cars in the garage, a television bigger than the wall in her mother's house, and a kitchen full of machines Chioma did not yet know how to use. For the first weeks, she floated through the rooms like someone afraid to wake up from a dream she had always wanted. She video called her mother and siblings often, turning the camera around to show the sitting room, the bathroom, the view from the high window. She could hear the wonder in their voices, and it filled her with golden, intoxicating pride. This was it. This was the life she had promised herself under her mother's leaking roof. But Mr. Kelvin, behind closed doors, was a different man entirely. The charm that had dazzled the village faded like paint in harsh sun. He was away often, sometimes 2 weeks at a stretch, and when he returned, he was cold, irritable, and occupied with a phone that never left his hand. He had rules, strict, unspoken rules about the house, about guests, about how things should be arranged, about how Chioma should dress when his colleagues visited. "Do not invite your village people here," he said one evening, without looking up from his plate. "I don't want that kind of company in my home." Chioma said nothing. She told herself it was work stress. She stirred her tea and looked out the tall window at the city lights and tried to remember the feeling of the wedding day. The gift stopped. The monthly allowance that replaced them barely covered groceries. Conversations became instructions. And then one rainy afternoon, Chioma answered the wrong phone, heard a soft familiar voice, and understood, in the way that a woman understands when she has been deliberately not looking, that she was not the only woman in Mr. Kelvin's life. When she confronted him, he looked at her with those cool, calculating eyes and said with a terrible calmness, "Chioma, be reasonable. You have a good life here. Don't ruin it with emotions." She sat across from him in the beautiful apartment and felt, for the first time, the full chill of a life built on the wrong foundation. She stayed longer than she should have, because she had no job, no savings in her own name, and because the shame of admitting the mistake felt bigger than the pain of staying. But life has its own schedule. The business collapsed. The cars were repossessed. The apartment was locked. Mr. Kelvin, stripped of his shining surfaces, became a stranger she had never truly known, and he sent her away with 2 boxes and words she would carry like scars: "You were never what I needed anyway." Chioma stood outside that locked door in the city, alone, her 2 boxes at her feet, people walking past without a second glance, and heard the sound of her old dream turning to dust. Then she picked up her boxes, walked to the bus station, and began the long road back to the place she had once been so desperate to leave. Emeka had come home 6 months before Chioma returned. He had come back not with noise, but with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who had done exactly what he said he would do. The construction business he had built from nothing, starting with rough hands and 15-hour days working under a contractor in the city, had grown into something real and respected. He employed workers. He owned vehicles. He had partnerships with companies across 3 cities. He had built his mother a proper house, concrete walls, tiled floors, running water, and had quietly, without making a performance of it, become the kind of man that the village pointed to when they wanted to show young boys what patient hard work could produce. When Chioma returned, thin, hollow-eyed, carrying her 2 boxes through the village in full view of everyone, Emeka heard about it from his mother that same evening. He listened. Nodded once. Said nothing. But that night, sitting on the veranda of his new house under a full moon, he sat with the strange, heavy feeling of a story arriving at the chapter he had always known was coming. He did not feel triumph. He was not that kind of man. He felt something older and quieter, something that had no clean name, somewhere between sour and understanding and the particular tiredness of having been right about something you wished you had been wrong about. She came to him on a Sunday afternoon. He was reading at his mother's house when Ada, now grown, serious, with her own quiet dignity, came to say Chioma was at the gate. He closed his book. walked out. And there she was. The years had written themselves on her clearly, not cruelly, but honestly. There was a weight in how she held herself, a careful softness in her eyes that had not existed when she had laughed at him under the mango tree. She was still beautiful. But it was the kind of beauty that had been through something and survived. "Emeka," she said, her voice barely staying together. "Please. Can we talk?" He held the gate open. He brought her inside. He brought her water. They sat across from each other, and the whole village history sat between them like a third person in the room. She told him everything. Not the version polished for sympathy, the real version, the honest one, the one that made her look as foolish as she had been. She told him about the locked apartment and the cold eyes and the words at the door. And then she looked at him and said, "I was wrong, Emeka. I was young and stupid and I humiliated you in front of people who respected you. You gave my family everything you had and I threw it in your face. I am not asking you to forget. I am asking if there is any mercy left in you for a second chance." The room was very still. Outside, the village moved in its ordinary Sunday rhythm. Somewhere in the mango tree, a bird called once and went quiet. Emeka looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was steady and without cruelty, the voice of a man who had long finished being angry and had arrived somewhere more final. "Chioma," he said, "I forgave you years ago. Not for you, for myself. I had too far to walk to carry that weight." He paused. Hope began to flicker cautiously in her eyes. He saw it. And gently, carefully, he continued. "But forgiveness is not the same as going back. When I had nothing, when I stood before you with only my love and my word, you called me poor in front of the whole village. You said what I had was not enough. You said I was not enough." He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the mango tree stood broad and permanent at the edge of the path, its roots deep and old in the red earth. He turned back to her. "I have spent years becoming more than enough. But not for you, Chioma. For myself." He looked at her quietly, finally, with no residue of bitterness, only clarity, clean and complete. "You are welcome in this village. You are welcome to start again. But I am not a door that was left open waiting. I closed that door gently, and I built a whole house around the place where it used to be." If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this, because sometimes, the choices we make today become the regrets we carry tomorrow. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this.